Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on Navigating Clinical Evaluation Excellence, a strategic guide for medical devices. Allow me to introduce our company, Celegence. We were established in 2017. Celegence uniquely combines operational, strategic, and scientific expertise with exclusive technology to help pharmaceutical, medical device, and IVD manufacturers achieve regulatory compliance in time and cost-efficient ways. Presented on the slide are some of the leading clients that we work with. We are headquartered in Chicago with offices around the globe. An overview of our medical device experience. We provide niche regulatory services such as MDR and IVDR gap analysis, CER writing, device registration, as well as ECTD publishing and other pharmaceutical support. We have extensive experience in EU MDR across a wide range of therapeutic areas as listed here on the slide. We have worked with several customers on addressing the notified body observations received on their clinical evaluation documents and successfully achieved EU MDR compliance for their documentation. Here at Celegence, we have a global pool of SMEs, including dentists, physicians, PhDs, engineers, regulatory experts, and medical writers. So about me, I am Parvati Nambiar, and I am a team lead at Celegence. I have a master's degree in microbiology and over 6 years of experience in medical writing. At Celegence, I lead a team of medical writers who work on CEPs, CERs, and other clinical evaluation documentation on therapeutic areas such as dentistry, IVF, and so on. On the panel with me today is Dr. Anushri Singh. Anushri, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Parvati. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Anushri Singh. I'm an associate manager here at Celegence. I have a doctorate degree in neuro-oncology with an overall experience of 6 years working as a researcher and lecturer. I have authored and reviewed several EU MDR compliant regulatory documents across a wide range of therapeutic areas. At Celegence, I lead a team of qualified medical writers, and we have successfully completed several projects addressing notified body observations.
Great to have you on the panel with me, Anushri. Hope to have a great discussion today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the session as well.
Okay, so today's webinar will focus on building a comprehensive strategy for your device and how to source the data for the evaluation. We will look at common notified body observations and discuss how to navigate them. And lastly, we will also look at technology as an efficient tool in the entire process. So there are certain important and necessary elements for a clinical evaluation. To start with, there needs to be a clinical evaluation plan in place for the device in question, following which the CR will need to be developed presenting the critical information. So the critical information will include data on device description, intended use, a systematic literature review on state-of-the-art device under evaluation, and so on. Other critical elements for the clinical evaluation would include a PMSR or a PSUR document, which will present PMS data on the subject device from the past and current evaluation periods. A PMCF will be required, and for Class 2B implantable and Class 3 devices, an SSCP will be required, wherein the document would be split into two parts, one for the HCP and the other for the patients. So how to develop a comprehensive clinical evaluation strategy? So as I mentioned previously, there are some critical information that needs to go into the CER, such as relevant scientific information on the safety, performance, the design, and the intended purpose of the device, along with all the available clinical investigations that have been carried out on the subject device, either internally by the manufacturer or data that we've gotten from other clinical investigation databases. And we also need to present information that's available on the alternative treatment options or alternative therapies that are available on the market, along with all the PMS data that's been generated for the subject device.
Yeah, you're right about that, Parvati. We have to keep in mind that we include both favorable and unfavorable data for the medical device, and also to perform an impartial and comprehensive assessment of the clinical data or the manufacturer health data that gets included in your clinical evaluation process. So essentially what we're trying to do here as part of the clinical evaluation is to demonstrate the safety and performance of your medical device with relevance to, with conformity to relevant GSPRs.
So now we have a poll question here to understand how the audience feels about this particular question. Alexia, could you please launch the poll? Yes. So the question would be on what do you consider the most challenging aspect of a CR? Would it be clinical benefits, literature appraisal, PMCF, or equivalence? Anushri, what do you think? What would be challenging in your understanding?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, and what we're essentially trying to gauge from the audience here is, what we've commonly seen in our experience at least has been the most challenging aspect of writing a CR is to identify your clinical benefits of a medical device. And also, I think the other hot topic, or the one that we're making more discussions on, is PMCF. So I would think that maybe people will go with these two options. So let's see what the results show.
Yeah, this should be interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
So interesting. So we definitely have clinical benefits taking the majority with 47% votes. We also do have 41% for literature appraisal. That's also interesting. And then, followed by PMCF and equivalence. So more or less what we thought, would be the case coming in from the audience for this webinar today. I do want to highlight that we would be talking about these aspects in the course of the webinar today.
Yes.
Right. So in terms of writing your clinical evaluation report, what kind of data should you have available before you move on to that step? So there are two types of data sources. One is your internal source of data, and the other is the external source of data. Your internal source will include any manufacturer-held data, which is essentially your technical documentation as listed here. And the external sources of data can come from various other sources, such as the literature databases, the clinical trial registries, adverse events databases, and or cybersecurity databases if your device has a software component or is a software as a medical device. Having pointed out the point about adverse event databases, I do want to highlight that this is a short list that we've included here as examples, but depending on where your medical device is marketed, you may want to check other databases as well in the geographical region where it is marketed. So speaking of manufacturer-held data, how can this be utilized in terms of creating your clinical evaluation report? So to start with, you should have data sources available, such as the technical file, the IFU, the risk files, and a previous clinical evaluation report if available. Following that, you will extract the information to have the information on your medical device with more details around the various aspects as listed here. And then you would then eventually go on to define the clinical benefits and the associated endpoints, following which we would then have the risk evaluation in place, which will be coming in from your literature or your adverse events databases. Essentially, what we're trying to do here, and one must keep in mind, is that you should know your device well. You should have the detailed information about your device. Make sure that the clinical benefits, whether indirect or direct benefits, are identified and defined in your CR. And lastly, evaluate the potential clinical risk to determine the overall benefit risk profile of your device. And before we jump ahead into the various sections or aspects involved in a CR, we'd like to touch upon the topic of notified body observations that we have seen from our experience here at Celegence. So we have broadly categorized them into 4 groups that you can see here. One is the data insufficiency. Next is data inconsistency, gaps in process, and poor documentation. So before we go ahead, Parvati, I would like to hear from you. So in your experience, out of these 4 categories, which is the most commonly that you have come across?
Okay, so from my experience, definitely there's I've seen a lot of notified body observations about data insufficiency, wherein the comments regarding insufficient clinical benefits, endpoints, and acceptance criteria that have been established, notified body has pointed out that they are not sufficient. And another example would be regarding poor documentation, wherein the search criteria that was presented or defined in the literature search protocol was not validated.
Right.
So keeping in mind that there are these 4 broad categories, we have other general observations that we've seen on manufacturer held data. So one of the types would be inconsistencies observed related to the verbiage that was written in all the clinical evaluation documents. So it was observed to be inconsistent across different documentation. And also lack of measurable or quantifiable claims, clinical benefits, and endpoints. And an example for gap in process would be the lack of a clinical development plan. So these were common observations that were seen, and let's just move on to see how we can tackle some of them. So as we've seen that clinical benefits and endpoints is a pain point that's been pointed out by our audience as well, and it's from our general observation also. That's one of the major points that comes up in notified body observations. So what do we need to do to not have these observations come up? So we need to define proper clinical benefits and endpoints. And while defining clinical benefits, what we need to make sure is that the clinical benefits are devised around patient and are patient focused and are measurable. So the benefits can be either direct or indirect, and they can be on the basis of the clinical outcome associated with the device used, or on the basis of quality of life or how it improves the patient's quality of life. If the device does not have a direct impact on patient health, then in case it is used in diagnostic aspects, we need to present benefits regarding the diagnostic purposes of the device and how it enables easier diagnosis of the disease. So as per the MDCG 2026 guidance, indirect clinical benefits may be demonstrable by evidence such as preclinical or bench test data, real-world data such as registries, insurance database records, or data from another device that is used along with the subject device on which the clinical data is available. So for example, there might not be a lot of clinical data available for guide wires. However, there'll be data available for stents which are used along with guide wires. So by establishing benefits for guide wires, we can rely on clinical data on the stents, and associated benefit can be demonstrated. So now that we have established proper benefits, we need to understand how these benefits are seen or observed in the patients. For that, endpoints are established, which will be the results of the benefits identified. The endpoints can be of 3 categories, either quantitative, which are numerical based, wherein there is measurable parameters in measuring these endpoints, or they can be qualitative, wherein it is non-numerical data, and it's basically about positive changes in the patient's life, or it can be threshold based, wherein evaluation is based on reaching predefined health standards. So some examples for these would be for quantitative data, for example, a cardiac defibrillator device. So an inappropriate shock rate of less than equal to 2% is considered acceptable. This would be a quantitative endpoint established. And for qualitative data, we can consider an orthopedic device such as ankle plates, wherein the endpoint would be improved mobility for the patient, resulting in bone healing. So this would generate data on the overall health improvement and nothing numerical. And for threshold-based data, suppose for an IVF petri dish with benefits around successful fertilization, the values established in special clinical guidance can be used as a threshold. So suppose a fertilization rate of greater than 60% is considered acceptable. So in some cases, there are no direct or diagnostic benefit to the patient from the use of the device. So for example, a blood pressure monitor used during a dialysis procedure. So this does not offer any direct benefit or diagnostic purpose, but with the value that it presents, the dialysis procedure can be fine-tuned for optimum therapy. In such cases, a surrogate endpoint can be established, which is expected to be the measure of therapy and hence is a final endpoint in itself.
Right. I agree with you, Parvati. We essentially have to make sure that, we define the clinical benefits well, and that, it is clear enough in your clinical evaluation report, like you said, so as to avoid such an observation. I know it can be difficult for certain kinds of devices, but, we have to try as much as possible sticking to the regulation or the requirements coming in from the MDR. Right. So now that we have established our clinical benefits, next comes the state-of-the-art section in your CR. We know that this is a very important section in the CR so as to establish the background, let's say, of the story that we are trying to present in terms of the device safety and performance. So I'd like to go through this particular section in terms of how would you go about writing the SOTA with an example. So if we consider your medical device to be an automated cryopreservation system, which is used to store specimens that can be used in the assisted reproductive technology procedure. So in this case, the medical condition that you would be talking about would be infertility. Then you would be presenting information in depth about the procedure, which is the cryopreservation of reproductive tissues, followed by highlighting how the cryopreservation technique actually works. How is the process carried out? What is the management of specimen like? What are the advantages and disadvantages of having such a system in place? Then we would go about mentioning other cryostorage systems that are available on the market, which is essentially your similar and competitor devices, and then followed by clinical practice guidelines that one should be considering when talking about such medical devices, which are cryostorage systems for reproductive tissues. And in line, basically, the similar devices and the clinical practice guidelines will then help us establish the acceptance criteria for the defined endpoints, and in turn will then help us evaluate the benefit risk profile of the device. And to finally conclude your state-of-the-art section, we will basically be at a stage where we can see where our device stands in terms of the state of the art when it comes to such devices on the market. So speaking of literature search protocol, so I know again from our poll, we saw that a lot of the audience, or second majority of the audience, did go ahead with the literature appraisal as being one of the other challenging aspects of a CR. So to help us with such a process, or to make it a seamless process, I would like to briefly touch upon our in-house proprietary tool called Captis that we have here at Celegence, which essentially helps us to have a one-stop platform to conduct the systematic literature review process for the state-of-the-art as well as the device under evaluation. It also helps us to be consistent and efficient in performing such a process. It can also serve as a central repository for your project-related documentation. So Parvati, before we move ahead, I would like to ask you, what has your experience been using Captis? What would you say in terms of using Captis versus the manual process that we had in place in the days ago?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I am all for Captis. Captis has definitely helped us, or helped me, with the literature review process. So like you mentioned previously, before Captis, we used to follow the literature process through Excel files or Excel sheets, and that was very tedious and also prone to a lot of errors. So now that we have Captis, that's all in the past. It's much more streamlined. It's much more smoother now. And also, we use Captis for the source document repository, where we add in the source documents for the tech file, or all of these for the subject device. And we can use them or cross-reference them directly from there. And it makes the process so much simpler and so much more streamlined. So yeah, Captis has been very helpful, yeah.
Yeah, I'm so glad gone are the days when we don't have to use Excel anymore, because it was quite a task and very tiring.
Yes.
Moving ahead, talking about state of the art, we would also like to touch upon some of the observations that we have seen from our experience. Some listed here, and what can you do about this? So in terms of lack of a detailed literature search protocol, very commonly seen from our experience, but also very easily avoidable. One should clearly define your literature search protocol for state-of-the-art versus device under evaluation. You should have the process as well as the criteria defined separately and clearly in your CER. The next one also, again, very easily avoidable is to have your inclusion and exclusion criteria defined before starting the literature screening process. So that can be done at the CP stage as well. And the last one being, as part of state-of-the-art section, you should have the details mentioned that we just talked about in the previous slide with the examples. So make sure all of these sections are covered and have detailed information to develop state-of-the-art.
Okay, so now let's consider a scenario wherein there is not enough clinical data available on the subject device. So you've done a DOE literature review and you haven't come across a lot of articles that can substantiate your safety and performance of the subject device. Or in a scenario wherein the subject device is completely new to the market, so there is not enough clinical data available to, again, substantiate the safety and performance of the device. In such a case, the manufacturer can choose to have an equivalence pathway established. And for that, they need to come up with, or they need to select an equivalent device, which has the same indicated purpose and the intended purpose as the subject device. So once this equivalent device has been established, or has been selected rather, what they would need to do is to demonstrate that the two devices, the subject device and the proposed equivalent device, are equivalent based on three characteristics, which would be technical characteristics, wherein the similarities and the differences in the technical specifications of the subject device versus the equivalent device have been demonstrated, and biological characteristics, wherein the biocompatibility and the potential risks associated with the devices used are presented, and clinical characteristics, wherein the clinical performance and safety of the equivalent devices and the subject devices are demonstrated. So the MDCG 2025 guidance on equivalence is very comprehensive and a suitable reference for CERs that follow the equivalence pathway. So there is a template presented for the equivalence table for what the comparison should look like between the subject device and the device presumed to be equivalent.
Yeah, in this case, Parvati, I would also like to add on a scenario. So, for example, if we do try and consider a predecessor or a different device from the same family to be an equivalent device, then there should be clear information about the relationship between the two devices. We know for a fact that there's a requirement in the MDR that if a device is being used as equivalent, the manufacturer should have complete access to its technical file and also to all the information related to the device being considered equivalent. I think which is why the concept of not considering a device which is not part of your product portfolio has almost become non-existent.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And as you can see, the notified body observations that come up in the equivalence pathway or the equivalence section is on these points. So the notified body reviewers have pointed out that there is not enough clarity regarding the data access that the manufacturer has with respect to the equivalent device that they're claiming equivalence to. So like Anushri mentioned, the first thing that the manufacturer would need to do is to have appropriate level of access with all the clinical data available on the equivalent device. And comments have also been raised on data insufficiency, wherein the technical and the clinical parameters that have been demonstrated for the equivalent device is pointed out by the notified body reviewer as not being sufficient and not to claim equivalence to the subject device. So I think the way about this, or way to go about this, would be to, first of all, have proper access to all the clinical data available and to make sure that there is sufficient data available on the technical characteristics, the biological characteristics, and the clinical characteristics of the subject and the equivalent device. So what other manufacturer-held data sources can we rely on to demonstrate safety and performance of the subject device? So some of the classic examples of internal testing reports for design verification and validation tests, or stability tests, shelf life tests, etc., can be relied upon to demonstrate according performance to the subject device. And biocompatibility studies on the subject device can be demonstrating the safety aspect of the subject device. Additionally, if there have been clinical investigations carried out on the subject devices, they also need to be presented in this clinical evaluation. An exception for this case can be along the lines of legacy devices and for devices that do not have any novel features. So for such devices, it is not necessary to have a clinical investigation in place, and the same can be stated in the CR also. It needs to be stated explicitly in the CR that for such and such reason, there are no clinical investigations performed for the subject devices.
Right, so now it's time for poll 2 for the audience. Alexa, could you please launch the poll 2? I think meanwhile, Parvati, I would just like to highlight that I think this would be all the more interesting. We already have answers coming in from poll 1, which sort of ties in with the second poll 2. The question being, in your opinion, what would drive the need for a PMCF? So let's see what the audience thinks, and we will talk further about this coming in.
Yeah, just curious, Anushri, what would you select amongst these options?
Right. So I think from my experience and working on, addressing PMCF related questions or coming up with a strategy, I would say all of these scenarios would be applicable. So let's see what the poll comes up with.
Yes, yeah. This should be interesting too.
Yes. Alexia, I think we can end the poll now. Thank you.
Oh.
Right. Oh, people do agree with me. That's nice to know.
Yeah.
So we do have the results, all of the above with 69%, followed by data on long-term safety and performance, followed by insufficient clinical evidence, and the last one, risk classification. So I think people are aware about the fact that irrespective of the risk classification of the medical device, you need to have a PMCF plan in place. And we'll discuss this further in our slides ahead.
Yes.
Right. So before we jump into the aspect of PMCF, I'd like to go a step back, which is your post-market surveillance. That basically is the basis in which you can then go on to address your PMCF. PMS essentially is the aim of the PMCF is essentially to actively and systematically collect, record, and analyze your data to then demonstrate safety and performance of your medical device throughout its life cycle. The manufacturers should also make sure that they do have preventive and corrective actions in place should there be any serious events coming in from the PMS findings or the adverse events databases. So PMCF, then we know that is a component of your PMS. It is a process that helps us update the clinical evaluation and then further integrates into the PMS plan. A PMS plan should ideally be established for either a device family, or a combination of device family. And then the PMCF plan can be developed using the MDCG 2027 guidance, which provides us with a template to do so. The findings from the PMCF activities can be documented further into a PMCF evaluation report. So like I said, PMCF is no longer an optional requirement irrespective of your risk classification, and it should ideally contain information about the various PMCF activities that you have planned. And these may be either general methods such as literature review, searches on adverse events databases, or these can also be specific PMCF activities that you may define, such as user surveys, clinical studies, etc. So talking of PMCF again, and one of the most commonly talked topic, I think, amongst a lot of forums, some of the observations that we have seen on this particular aspect of the CR, and I think can be addressed quite easily, is the fact that if you see on the screen, the lack of the PMCF plan lacking enough details on the planned PMCF activities these should be thoroughly addressed with details, including the objectives of your PMCF plan studies. Let's take the example of a user-based survey or a HCP survey in this case. So make sure you have the objectives defined. You have the sample size that you want to target defined as well. This can be done with the help of a biostatistician if you have one in place. And then make sure that you have endpoints defined in terms of timelines for the activity. For example, the PMC activity of a user survey may be open for the next 6 months or so, and then make sure that followed by which you have to make sure that the data analysis methods are also clearly included and defined in your PMCF plan. And another one that we can look at, and again, can be avoided quite easily, is to have in place clinically relevant risks defined from your literature or from your adverse events databases that are coming in and should be included in your PMCF plan. Also, before we jump into risk management, again, just one last thought on PMCF. Again, since it's the most talked about topic, I think, these days in terms of clinical evaluation, is another scenario wherein if your medical device has multiple indications, and let's say it has 3 indications, and you lack clinical evidence for 1 out of 3 indications. So in that case, you can either go with an equivalence pathway if you have a predecessor device data available with you, or you can choose to do a PMCF activity, a specific one, such as a user survey, provided you have the feasibility to do so. So once we have addressed the PMS sections in the CER, then comes the risk management. So the other aim of the clinical evaluation is to essentially determine the benefit risk profile for the device in question. According to Article 10 of the EU MDR, the requirements for risk management include having a risk management plan in place, and followed by identification and analysis of hazards. And then you need to make sure that you estimate and evaluate the risk already known well, and you have control measures in place should there be any serious events. And you should also have an ongoing evaluation process in place based on the PMS data. So essentially what we're trying to do here is to minimize the known risks and also mitigate the unknown risks that come out of the clinical evaluation process. So we need to ensure that the risks related to the device are acceptable, and these should be clearly highlighted in the CER. So again, observations that we have seen in our experience regarding the risk analysis or the risk management documentation, some of these are quite straightforward. So I would like to highlight on what you can do as part of the clinical evaluation report writing when it comes to risks that have been identified. So for instance, there are risks that have been identified from the literature screening process or from the adverse events search. You will need to then map these with the technical documentation that you have available, such as the IFU or the risk management file, and ensure that these risks are included in your technical documentation. Should there be a scenario where a new risks have come from these various data sources and are not part of your technical documentation, then it would be recommended that the update for these IFUs as well as risk files is done at the earliest.
Okay, so from whatever we presented in the slide before this, we presented all the information that needs to be added into the clinical evaluation report. The critical clinical data to demonstrate that the devices are safe and performs as intended, the benefit risk assessment, all of this. So now what we need to do is to collate all of this data and present it in the section for conformity to general safety and performance requirements, wherein relevance or conformity to certain relevant GSPRs need to be established. For this, what we need to do is we need to rely on data that's been presented in the CER before. So for safety, we can use data from biocompatibility tests that have been conducted. We need to bring up the PMS data related to the complaints that have come up from the PMS evaluation carried out, and also the data that's been generated from DUE clinical evaluation or the literature search that has been carried out, any adverse events that have come up in the literature, as well as from adverse event databases. They also need to be presented over here. And as Anushri previously mentioned, we need to map it to the risks file and the IFU to show that these have been mitigated and are presented in the risk documents for the subject device. Additionally, to show that the device performs as intended, we need to demonstrate we need to present data related to the non-clinical testing that has been carried out on verification and validation tests on design, or the shelf life stability tests, etc. And also, again, data from the DOE literature needs to be presented to demonstrate that the device, when used in patients, performs as intended, and performs as intended. And the other thing to also check would be to demonstrate that the device does not have any side effects, and anything that has come up in the adverse event databases are known risks. There have been no new or unknown risks that have come up, or in case there have been any new or new risks that have come up, they need to be mapped to the technical file accordingly. So while demonstrating compliance or conformity to these GSPRs, what we need to see is that the device performs as intended, is safe for its use, and that the benefits associated with the use of the device are higher than the risks associated with it. So once all of this data is presented, and appropriate cross-referencing needs to be done in the document so that the notified body reviewer can go back to the relevant sections and see that the data has been presented elaborately in the section and has been summarized accordingly in the conformity to GSPR section. So to go over some of the general observations that we've seen with respect to a clinical evaluation process and all the documents that are going along in that process. So we've commonly seen errors related to cross-referencing within the documents, wherein the cross-referencing links placed are either not working or they do not direct to the correct section that needs to be actually referred to. Other inconsistencies regarding the presentation of data in the CEP versus the CR or PMS plan, etc., or any of the documents in the clinical evaluation process, they need to be consistent across, and all of the documents need to present the same data or the single source of truth. And there have also been observations related to errors or inconsistencies in the presentation of tables or figures that present the results from literature analysis for DUE or SOTA. There have been comments on how the figure presented does not relate to the table that presents the same data, and vice versa. So all of these need to be made sure of before we submit for the clinical evaluation process, so that such errors don't come up and such observations don't come up during our notified body review. So from what we understand, or what we've talked about throughout this webinar, we know that there are multiple teams involved in the process of clinical evaluation. So the R&D team, the risk team, the PMS team, the clinical affairs, regulatory affairs, and so on, all of these departments have a critical role to play, and they are important stakeholders. So for the process of a clinical evaluation to go on smoothly, collaboration is very important. And each document that comes up from each of these departments need to be correct and need to present the right amount of data. And open communication between these departments and collaboration between the teams is ideal to allow the necessary exchange of ideas and information.
Yeah, you're right about that, Parvati. So it is very important to highlight the fact that not only should there be collaboration between the different departments involved in the clinical evaluation process, but there should be collaboration amongst the technical documentation so as to have the consistent information for your device.
Yes, that's very true.
Right. So as we are coming towards the end of the session today, we would like to give some key takeaways to bring back to your medical devices. The first one being, make sure that you have the manufacturer-held technical documentation in an easily searchable format for the notified body reviewers. Ensure that you have the detailed device information available, which can also include any accessories that might be used with your medical device, or include information about the software component if applicable. Clearly define the clinical benefits, whether these are direct or indirect, and the associated objectives or endpoints with it, showcasing the device safety and performance. Establish your acceptance criteria derived from literature or the clinical profession guidelines, again, to demonstrate the safety and performance of your medical device. Make sure that you have the detailed literature search protocol and output clearly defined in your report for state-of-the-art as well as device under evaluation. Align all your technical documentation with clinically identified risks that are outlined in your CER. Develop a proactive PMCF strategy and also include a PMCF plan in place, which I think most of our audience already knows that it's about strategizing how to go about PMCF. And lastly, demonstrate that the clinical evaluation that you've included in your report conforms to the relevant GSPRs. So talking about captives, I would like to highlight that we do have the option of booking a captives demo with us. So you can reach out to us at celegence.com for any demo. And for any further questions, feel free to reach out to Parvati or I on our respective email IDs.
Thank you so much, ladies. A very, very interesting presentation indeed that resonates with a lot of questions that we see in the events that we run on clinical research. We do have quite a number of questions that have come through the Q&A box. Can you just confirm to me that you see those questions on your end as well?
Yes, we do see it.
Fantastic. I'll let you go ahead then and reply to them in the order that you see most fit. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexia. So Parvati, let me start with reading up some of the questions. As usual, we know from the poll as well, some questions coming in. I would throw this first one onto you. Recently, notified bodies have indicated that there should be a quantitative measurement for benefit risk profile. Could you provide any guidance on this?
Like I mentioned, the guidance would be regarding how to go about understanding your device, the way it performs, or what exactly is the purpose of your device. So once you define that, then you can go about understanding what the device exactly does to the patient. And based on that, you can develop the benefits that come along with the use of the device. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think we're on the right track. Thank you for that. The next one I can take up on the hot topic of our discussion is about PMCF. Okay, I seem to have lost that question. I'm not sure why. I will come back to that. We'll take the next question here. Can we claim equivalence if we do not have access to a competitor device's technical documentation? I can take that one up. So like I said, as part of the webinar discussion itself, we would recommend avoiding, we would recommend not using a competitor or a similar device for the same very aspect, wherein you do not have access to the technical documentation of the device. Instead, if you have a predecessor device or a device from the same family, it's better to use those as an equivalent device in question. And you can also have multiple equivalent devices considering lack of clinical data. But in cases wherein you cannot use the equivalence pathway for the said reasons, then you can also go ahead with a PMCF strategy. And you may choose to do the general PMCF methods if your, let's say, the device is perhaps an accessory device and does not really have the need for a PMCF specific activity. Right. Yeah, so there's one coming in about PMS data, Parvati. I'll throw that one to you. When performing an update to the CER, is it needed to check against all of the PMS data, or can we check against the PMS data from the date of the last updated CER?
Okay, that's a good question. So if you have a PMS, if you have the PMS data from the previous evaluation period or the last updated CR, then it would be, I think it would be better to have the data from the last updated CR along with the PMS data generated for the current evaluation period so that you can establish a trend analysis and see that the safety and the events related to or the complaints that come up in the current evaluation period versus the previous evaluation period, we can do a comparison and see that there is an increase or a decrease in the trends associated with these complaint types. And in the end, that will help demonstrate that the device remains safe and performs as intended and continues to remain safe as well. So comparing PMS data from the previous evaluation versus current evaluation would be the right way to go.
Right. Thank you for that. The next one is there a guidance from team notified body? I'm not sure if the audience member is asking for a specific guidance. Maybe we can just highlight the fact that you can refer to the EU MDR and also the MDCG guidance documents available. If you're still in the session, I would request you to be more specific with your questions. That would help us to answer. Right. Let's take another one. Is it important to segregate device safety and performance and state-of-the-art literature? Parvati, why don't you go ahead and answer this?
All right, yeah, I would say yes. So the literature generated on state-of-the-art versus the safety and performance of the device are completely different and they need to present different kind of data. So from the literature that we go through for state-of-the-art, like Anushri presented in the slide deck, it needs to give information about the medical condition, the similar devices that are available on the market, which perform the same indicated or which are used for the same indicated purpose and are for the intended purpose also. And also needs to present data regarding the alternative treatment or therapy options available in the market to just show that the device is state of the art and how they function the same way as the other devices available on the market. Whereas for literature that are generated for the device under evaluation, that exclusively presents data on the safety and performance of the subject device, or if you're claiming equivalence, then there'll be equivalent device data as well. So both sets of literature will present different kind of data, and both are important to be presented in the clinical evaluation for a complete analysis of the safety and performance characteristics.
And I think it's important to highlight that, these should be separated out and should be, like I said in my talk as well, that these should be the various criteria for addressing this should be clearly highlighted separately.
Yes.
Alexia, I just wanted to check base with you. How much more time do we have? We still see a lot of questions popping in.
Indeed. So we do have quite a number of questions still to address. I guess we can take 5 more minutes if that's okay. And any questions that you cannot address in the live session today, we can of course have you address over email post session. That'll be perfectly fine.
All right, great. Thank you. So we'll take a couple more questions then, given the time that we have for today. The next one is on PMCF. I can take that one. Once the PMCF activity is initiated, is it required that this process be continuously conducted, or does it resolve once the required sample size is acquired? I would like to highlight that getting the sample size for a PMCF activity, of course, is one of the steps. It does not stop at the conclusion of that PMCF activity. You still need to perform your specific PMCF activity. I'm not sure what you mean in terms of the activity defining here. It could be a user survey or a clinical study. The PMCF activity would be completed in terms of getting the results from that particular activity after the let's say the clinical study or the user survey is completed, we analyze the results and then go on to then eventually have the data results into the PMCF PMCF evaluation report. So it does not stop at the sample size step, if that answers your question. Right. So we'll take one last question from the audience. Right. Parvati, would you like to take up this last one? Is it important to update the CEP as well with every periodic update on the CER?
Yes, most definitely. So that was the first line that I said in the webinar deck. That's the first document that needs to come out in your clinical evaluation. So you need to establish a robust clinical evaluation plan with the date range established, with the similar devices that you're going to compare your subject devices against. If there's an equivalence pathway that's chosen, you need to present that this is the equivalent device that you are claiming equivalence to. And
which may not be the case in the previous clinical evaluation, right?
Yes.
So yeah, that information has to go in there.
So yeah, basically, yes, you need to develop a clinical evaluation plan for every update of the clinical evaluation report.
All right. I think the rest of the questions, like Alexia mentioned, we will reach out to you via email and answer those questions. We will address each one of them. Thank you.
Thank you for posing these questions.
Thank you indeed to the audience for so many very interesting questions. Thank you to you both for this very insightful presentation. Ladies, once more, I want to take a moment to thank you kindly for your participation. Thanks, Celegence, as well, for running this webinar with us. I do recommend everyone goes directly to your website to know more about the organization and the interesting and very useful solutions that you can offer this audience. Thanks again once more, everyone, for logging in today, and we hope to see you very soon in our next set of webinars.
Thank you, Alexia. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Take care.